Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be doing part 2 of my review on the birth of the Palestinian refugee problem revisited by Benny Morris. My first review was the longest I think I've done single review on this channel since last October. And part of it was I had to do quite a bit of editorializing about some of Benny Morris's assertions, really his personal opinions. I won't be doing that so much in this part, in part because I'll be reading a lot of the extensive documentation that Benny Morris has helpfully offered on Palestinian expulsions of Palestinians, atrocities committed against Palestinians, the accounts of looting by the IDF and by other Zionists and Jews, and the attitude of the Israelis towards the end of this war and what would set the stage for where we are now. Okay, so hopefully it won't be as long, but as I said to those people, I really applauded those of you who decided to stay with me for that entire review because it was, I think, an important part of what I've come to learn in this study. Ultimately, the atmosphere of transfer, as we shall see, prevailed through April to June. So Morris divides this into things that happened up till March of 1948, then April to June, which includes the unilateral declaration of the independence of the State of Israel. Most communities attacked were evacuated, and where no spontaneous evacuation occurred, communities more often than not were expelled. Throughout, Arabs who had fled were prevented from returning to their homes. In some areas, villages that surrendered were disarmed and then expelled. In others, Haganah and IZL and LHI units refused to accept surrender, triggering departure. But still, because of the absence of a clear central expulsive policy order, different units behaved differently. The Givati, Harel, and Yifta brigades almost invariably ascertained that no Arab inhabitants remained in areas they had just conquered. The Golani brigade, on the other hand, acted with far less consistency. There is also substantial evidence that in various rural areas, neighborhood NCs, ALA, and local commanders, ALA remembers the Arab Liberation Army, ALA and local commanders and Mukhtars. Mukhtars are, you could say, the closest to a village chieftain, sort of the authority in a village. Mukhtars made serious efforts during April to June to curtail flight, alongside fewer instances in other places to promote flight. At Al-Bira, next to Ramallah, foreign irregulars prevented locals from leaving. In Burayir, in the Gaza district, the foreign irregulars commander tried to stem flight. In Lida, an Iraqi officer was reported at the end of April to have forced, at gunpoint, fleeing villagers to return. Similarly, the Marshad family from Sindayana was forced to return home by ALA officers. North of Gaza, Majdal's militiamen forced villagers fleeing neighborhood Beit Daras to return. Indeed, a few days later, Majdal's NC ordered the inhabitants of Barka, Batani al-Harbi, and Batani al-Sharki, Yasur, Beit Daras, and the three Sawafir villages, Harbiya, Shamaliya, and Sharkiya, not to flee, on pain of punishment. So, unlike the Israeli school children, the Israeli narrative given to school children, which is their leaders told them to flee, here Morris is documenting over and over and over how we have situations in which not only were they not told to flee, but they're forced back to their villages at gunpoint, especially by this time in the second wave, after what had been witnessed from the expulsions from the first wave before April. People started to realize if we leave, we're not going to get to come back. People started to realize this, and also the ALA and other of the attacking Arab armies realized that this would lead to a big refugee wave, which would not only prevent them from attacking — you can't attack when there's refugees crowding the road — but this would create big burdens on these different governments and obviously demoralize people. So, no, they were not told to leave, contrary to the propaganda spread by the Israelis, something I've seen in the comment section, probably more so last year. I don't see it as much anymore, but the idea that they were told to leave, this is just nonsense. Again, something I really love, Morris does extensive footnotes with evidence, all of the archives that he consulted. I have found no contemporary evidence of official calls by any Arab government. I have found no evidence that the Palestinians or any substantial group left because they heard such calls or orders from outside Arab leaders. The BBC for years monitored Arab radio broadcasts. In the early 1970s, John Zimmerman checked the BBC monitoring reports to see whether they referred to broadcast Arab orders to evacuate. In 1973 to 1974, he published Radio Propaganda in the Arab-Israeli War, 1948. He found no such broadcasts, only reports of broadcasts describing the evacuation of women and children from a handful of sites. The Yishuv spokesman would no doubt have made use of such a monitored order or orders, if only to rebut Arab charges in the UN and elsewhere that the Yishuv was conducting a policy of expulsion vis-a-vis the Palestinians. Had the HIS, remember HIS is the Haganah Intelligence Services, or any Yishuv body had the text of a blanket Arab order to evacuate or solid references to such an order, it would without doubt have brandished and broadcast them to high heaven, but the Yishuv never did. If there is evidence that the Arabs told them to leave, why don't you show us the evidence? And Morris is pointing out there is no evidence because there was no such call. This is a bit of a summary. This comes from the conclusion of his section on the second wave, and I think it's a useful way to think about what was it that led to flight. As he notes, it wasn't one single cause. There were many different things that were happening, but it did lead to expulsion, flight, fear. So I'm going to read through his points here. The Arab inhabitants of Haifa, Jaffa, Tiberias, and to a lesser extent Safad, Basin, and Acre had for months suffered from a collapse of administration and law and order, difficulties of communications and supplies, isolation, siege, skirmishing, and intermittent harassment at the hands of Jewish troops. In the case of Jaffa, Haifa, and Jerusalem, the steady exodus of the middle and upper classes over December 1947 to March 1948 considerably demoralized the remaining inhabitants and provided a model for their own departure once conditions became intolerable. The urban masses and the fellahin had traditionally looked to the nobility for leadership, as does anybody. You look to the elites in your society for leadership. That doesn't make the Palestinians different there. A major factor in the exodus from the towns was the earlier fall of and exodus from other towns. The exodus from Arab Tiberias served as a pointer and model for Haifa's Arab leaders on the eve of their own decision to evacuate. It also undermined morale in Safad. Even more telling were the fall and exodus of Arab Haifa. These strongly affected the inhabitants of Jaffa and also radiated defeatism throughout the north, affecting Safad, Basin, and Acre. If mighty Haifa could fall and be uprooted, how could relatively unarmed small communities hope to hold out? Moreover, the exodus from the towns demoralized the surrounding hinterland. The fall of Tiberias had resulted in the exodus of villages along the Sea of Galilee shoreline, and the collapse of Jaffa had a similar effect on such villages as Salama, Yazur, and Keria. The atrocity factor certainly fueled the process. What happened, or allegedly happened, at Nasser ad-Din demoralized Arab Tiberias. In a more general way, the massacre at Deir Yassin and the exaggerated descriptions broadcast on Arab radio stations for weeks undermined morale throughout Palestine, especially in the countryside. Now, to be clear, Morris is not one of these denialists. There's actually, I think, a book out by some crazy person that says that the massacre at Deir Yassin never happened. What he means by exaggerated is that instead of, I think the numbers are something like 200 some men, women, and children killed, it was something like 1,000 or 2,000. And as you know, it's a game of telephone when somebody tells one thing and then it builds up in the mind. And so when he says exaggerations, he doesn't mean that people were lying. It was panic. People were telling other things, and it could have gotten exaggerated in that sense. But certainly the cruelty and the massacre, that could not have been exaggerated. People understood what was going on there, and that scared them. They thought if that could happen to Deir Yassin, keep in mind, Deir Yassin had a peace, effectively a peace treaty with the Yishuv, a non-aggression pact, and they had even fought to keep Arab irregulars, militiamen out of the town. And that's how they were rewarded with a massacre. So people thought, well, if this is what you get for being friends with the Zionists, what would happen if we'd even had one of our young men had gone out to fight and then they'd come and destroy the whole village? Undoubtedly, as was understood by IDF intelligence, the most important single factor in the exodus of April to June was Jewish attack. This is demonstrated clearly by the fact that each exodus occurred during or in the immediate wake of military assault. I want to point out, this is, when you're talking about April to June, part of that is before Israel has declared independence. But if you accept that Israel accepted the UN partition, this would mean they were attacking their own citizens inside their own partition borders. So where was the war started by the Palestinians? Where were the 6 invading Arab armies? Nowhere to be found. This is demonstrated clearly by the fact that each exodus occurred during or in the immediate wake of military assault. No town was abandoned by the bulk of its population before the main Haganah IZL assault. So why did people flee? Because they were attacked. What would you expect civilians to do? They're supposed to hold out with no weapons? It's unreasonable to expect them to just stay there. In the countryside, while many of the villages were abandoned during Haganah IZL attacks, and because of them, other villages were evacuated as a result of Jewish attacks on neighboring villages or towns. They feared that they would be next. So it didn't have to be your town that was attacked, just the neighboring town being attacked. That would be enough for you to flee. And again, that is completely reasonable behavior. In general, Haganah operational orders for attacks on towns did not call for the expulsion or eviction of the civilian population, but from early April, operational orders for attacks on villages and clusters of villages more often than not called for the destruction of villages and implicitly or explicitly expulsion. So once again, Morris is trying to push this idea, there's no master plan written down anywhere, therefore you can't claim that. And then the very next sentence, but from early April, operational orders, blah, 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 implicitly or explicitly expulsion. So I don't know what Morris is attempting to accomplish by saying there wasn't some master plan written. Ben-Gurion was careful enough not to write something down like that to give evidence, but the evidence is in the actions. Often something I've said that's a big thing for me in my life, but I think matters here especially, is don't listen to what people say, watch what they do. And so it doesn't matter what was written down, it's what did we see over and over, and we saw expulsions. No doubt the spectacle of panicky flight served to whet the appetites of Haganah commanders and perhaps the HGS as well. Like Ben-Gurion, they realized that a transfer of the prospective large minority out of the emergent Jewish state had begun, and that with very little extra effort and nudging, it could be expanded. The temptation proved very strong for solid military and political reasons. These are attacking Arab inhabitants of what would have been partitioned Israel. So this was not a war with the Arabs. This was a war on their own people, what would have been their own citizens, to force them to leave. And I don't see how anyone could say that would be justified, especially when the Jews had said publicly for years, we will respect the rights. This is going to be good for everybody economically. Let's live together in peace. And we realized that was all words. What did their actions show? That those were all lies. So now let's talk about some of the expulsion orders which Morris gives throughout. Remember, he says there's no official overarching government policy or military policy, and then he gives over and over orders. By the 10th of April, Haganah orders explicitly called for the liquidation of villages. By the 14th of April, Operation Nashon HQ, within the context of cleansing operations, generally ordered the continuation of intimidation and cleansing activities as a first stage in operations geared to the destruction and conquest of enemy forces and bases, i.e. villages. The order posited the blowing up of the enemy, quote, bases of Al-Kubayb, Akir, Bidu, Beit Surik, Beit Iksa, Beit Masir, and Suba, and Ramla. These were not military bases. These were villages. So they said, well, because the enemy could come there, which, by the way, they hadn't yet. There hadn't been an invasion. We are classifying them as bases and blowing them up ahead of time. Battalion 2 was ordered to attack with the aim of annihilation and destruction and arson the village of Beit Surik. Battalion 1 was ordered to attack with the aim of annihilation and destruction and temporary occupation the village of Beit Jiz, and to destroy at least 7 houses in Al-Kubayb. Battalion 3 was ordered to annihilate and destroy the village of Sajad. On 16th April, Nashan forces conquered and blew up Saris, including the mosque and school, before withdrawing. Remember, this is why I value Morris, is because he brings the evidence. And despite whatever his personal views are, he manages to share this evidence with the world in his books. In the south, so this is in the Negev Nakab. In the south, Alon, in the course of Operation Yoav and its aftermath, apparently never issued such general orders in writing. At any rate, none have surfaced in the archives, i.e. none that Benny Morris was allowed to see in the archives. It doesn't mean that they don't exist. But he most certainly passed on expulsive guidelines orally. So listen to the certainty with which Morris says this. He most certainly passed on. And indeed, almost no Arabs remained in the towns and villages conquered in that campaign. So, a UN report based on testimony by the expellees described what happened at Khirbet Beit Awa. On the 19th of March, they heard machine gun fire all around. Women and children began to cry. An IDF sergeant and about 25 soldiers picked out 3 notables and told them that the inhabitants of Khirbet Beit Awa would be authorized to stay there and cultivate part of their fields if they provided cows and sheep to the Jewish troops. The 3 notables agreed, but the next day, the same Jewish sergeant arrived with 50 soldiers and ordered the people to leave within 2 hours. 1,800 Arab civilians, old men and women included, left the village with only a small part of their belongings. For the time being, part of them are sheltered in caves between Beit Awa and Dura. Some have fled towards Hebron. So we even have times in which the Israelis had said, you can stay, and then in that particular case, they went back on their word the very next day. This is in negotiations with the Egyptians. Most of the civilians remained and were placed under military government rule with nightly curfews and severe restrictions on movement. The Egyptians had insisted that the armistice agreement explicitly guarantee their safety. In the appended exchange of letters, Israel agreed that those of the civilian population who may wish to remain in Al-Fallujah and Iraq al-Manshiyah are to be permitted to do so. All of these civilians shall be fully secure in their persons, abodes, property, and personal effects. But keep in mind, this is the IDF, and 99% of the time, it's going to be a lie. And here it is. But within days, Israel went back on its word. Southern Front's soldiers mounted a short, sharp, well-orchestrated campaign of low-key violence and psychological warfare designed to intimidate the inhabitants into flight. According to one villager's recollection, the Jews created a situation of terror, entered the houses, and beat the people with rifle butts. Contemporary United Nations and Quakers documents support this description. The UN mediator, Ralph Bunche, he's the one who took over after Count Bernadotte was murdered by Jewish terrorists. Ralph Bunche, quoting UN observers on the spot, complained that Arab civilians at Al-Fallujah have been beaten and robbed by Israeli soldiers, and that there have been some cases of attempted rape. The Quaker team, who were at Fallujah between the 26th of February and the 6th of March, assessing the civilians' food and medical needs, kept a diary. On the 3rd of March, they wrote that about half the people of Fallujah planned to remain. But at Iraq al-Manshiyah, the acting Mukhtar told them that the people had been much molested by the frequent shooting, by being told that they would be killed if they did not go to Hebron, and by the Jews breaking into their homes and stealing things. On March the 4th, at 2:30 in the morning, they recorded the worst barrage of shooting we had heard all week, about 300 rounds by a machine gun within 100 yards of where we were sleeping. And at 6:30 in the morning, the boy living in one of the rooms of our compound brought a man into the room where I was sleeping. His eye was bloody, and he had other wounds on his face and ear. He had been beaten by the Jahudi. The Quaker and UN observers complained to an Israeli officer. He reportedly replied they had some new recruits stationed there, and new recruits are the same the world over. When they get a hold of a gun, they want to shoot and shoot and shoot. At 9 in the morning, Jane Smith, one of the Quaker party, had bandaged 6 men. The worst case was a man with 2 bloody eyes, a torn ear, and a face pounded until it was blue. A young Arab told me we could not sleep last night because of much shooting and because the Israeli soldiers came into the homes and tried to make it into the Arab women. I asked, did they succeed? He answered no, because the women could be heard screaming and the men would run to chase the Israeli soldiers away. They asked when the trucks would go to Hebron because all the people in Fallujah wanted to go to Hebron. The Quaker said that the Arabs now wanted to leave, but that sincere reassurances by Israeli officials could still persuade the Arabs to stay. No such reassurances were forthcoming. What a surprise. The intimidation operation was orchestrated by Rabin, Alon's head of operations. Yadin dismissed the United Nations complaints of Israeli intimidation as exaggerated. Do we believe that this was exaggerated? No, we have too much evidence to know that it wasn't exaggerated, that it was probably pretty mild. What we just read there, that's pretty mild in comparison to what we've seen before. So now we're going to get into documentation of atrocities. Don't have time to talk about all of the atrocities. I just selected a few of them for us to hear. It will be difficult to hear, but I would encourage you to hear it because it's important. And we have to pay tribute to those Palestinians that were murdered and were forgotten. And by listening to these atrocities, we have an opportunity to remember them in some way and hopefully realize that their cause is something worth fighting for. On the 12th of January 1948, militiamen from Kibbutz Ramat HaKovesh, contrary to explicit Haganah's orders, shot at two Arab women, perhaps cultivating a field nearby. At least one was injured and may have died. The matter was the subject of an internal investigation. No one appears to have been punished. Big surprise. At the end of February, Haganah guards murdered an Arab peasant and his wife near Kfar Uriya without any provocation, according to HIS. HIS, Haganah Intelligence Services, they said that these Arabs were murdered without any provocation. Not UN propaganda. On the 24th of January, four Palmanics boarded a taxi, Palmanics, Jewish paramilitary, boarded a taxi in Tiberias and murdered the Arab driver, who may have been connected to irregulars. Ben-Gurion was probably referring to such incidents when he criticized condemnable acts against Arabs at a meeting of the Defense Committee in early February. What's important to keep in mind is you have soldiers and settlers acting this way because they feel like they can. If they really felt that they would get prosecuted or would get in any kind of trouble for this, they wouldn't risk it. But because they knew they would be safe, and that policy has been the same from 1948 to the present, the Jews will never bring their own to justice. It doesn't matter if they, murdered 100 women in the street, they're never going to be brought to justice. That's just the reality of things. What are we talking about? This is the shelling of Jaffa. The mortars were aimed roughly at the port area, the Clock Square, the prison, King George Boulevard, and Ayami. Cunningham wrote a few days later, it should be made clear that IZL attack with mortars was indiscriminate and designed to create panic among the civilian inhabitants. What a surprise. The IDF attacks civilians. So when you realize it's 2024 and people are, wow, I can't believe the IDF attacked civilians. It's 1948. This is what they did. They just shelled Jaffa. And indeed, most of the casualties were civilians, according to Haganah intelligence. So, again, that's not a conspiracy theory. That's just what was reported and that Morris dug out of the archive and reported on. But it is exactly at odds with what Israeli school children are taught about what happened. On the 9th of April, 80 IZL and 40 LHI troopers for part of the battle supported by Haganah machine gunners from nearby Givat Shaul and two Palma armored car squads attacked and took Deir Yassin, which, as we have seen, had signed a non-belligerency pact with its Jewish neighbors and repeatedly had barred entry to foreign irregulars. This is the operational commander of HIS in Jerusalem, Yitzhak Levy. He reported the conquest of the village was carried out with great cruelty. Whole families, women, old people, children were killed. Some of the prisoners moved to places of detention, including women and children, were murdered viciously by their captors. Another HIS operative Mordecai Gishon reported on the 10th of April, their commander says that the initial order was to take prisoner the adult males and to send the women and children to Matzah. In the afternoon, the order was changed and became to kill all the prisoners. The adult males were taken to town in trucks and paraded in the city streets, then taken back to the site and killed with rifle and machine gun fire. Before the other inhabitants were put on the trucks, the IZL and LHI men took from them all the jewelry and stole their money. The behavior toward them was especially barbaric and included kicks, shoves with rifle butts, spitting and cursing. People from Givat Shaul took part in the torture, the civilians. So it's one thing to say there's a few bad apples, so we could see if there was one person or two people inside a battalion or inside a brigade or inside even a small unit doing this. But the entire unit did it, and then the civilians, the settlers, came in on it too. This is a people who think it is okay to do this. They have thought that it was okay to do this since 1948. This is not a new thing that is happening in 2024. You have to understand that. And if you understand that, then you'll see that this makes sense. And it's part of a continuous, as Professor Rashid Khalidi says, and I'll put a card to that, 100 years war on Palestine. And he was saying from 1917 to 2017, we're a few years beyond that now. But the idea is still the same. This war has been going on for over a century now. Meir Payil, a Palma intelligence officer who claimed to have spent part of the afternoon of the 9th of April in Deir Yassin as a guest of the LHI, reported on the 10th of April, in the quarry near Givat Shaul, I saw the 5 Arabs they had paraded in the streets of the city. They had been murdered and were lying one on top of the other. I saw with my own eyes several families that had been murdered with their women, children, and old people. Their corpses were lying on top of each other. The dissidents were going about the village, robbing and stealing everything. Chickens, radio sets, sugar, money, gold, and more. Each dissident walked about the village dirty with blood and proud of the number of persons he had killed. Their lack of education and intelligence as compared to our soldiers, i.e. the Haganah, was apparent. In one of the houses at the center of the village were assembled some 200 women and small children. The women sat quietly and didn't utter a word. When I arrived, the commander explained that they intended to kill all of them, but in the evening I heard that the women and children had been transported and released in Musrata. On the 21st of May, Arab authorities in Ramla informed the Red Cross that the Jews had committed barbaric acts in Abu Shusha and called for Red Cross intervention. One Haganah soldier twice attempted to rape a 20-year-old woman prisoner. Abu Shusha's remaining inhabitants were expelled, apparently on the 21st of May. The 9th Battalion troops killed a large number of villagers, apparently executing dozens of army-age males. They appear also to have raped and murdered a teenage girl. So, rape is one of those emotive crimes that can remove barriers to people. So if they are normally peace-loving people and then they find out that there has been rape, then they will allow for violence towards the people who had committed the rape. And that's why one of the things that you saw on October the 7th that were all the lies about the mass rapes that the IDF and other people put forward, which has now been shown to be completely baseless, no evidence, part of the standard. But usually what happens, same thing with human shields. The IDF accuses the Palestinians of something that they do regularly. It's a sort of weird way of deflection or projection, however you want to look at it, that the IDF soldiers regularly commit rape, so they need to accuse other people of doing it in order to cover, distract, throw attention away from this. But over and over in the documentation, Morris refers to instances of rape. This is widespread. This is endemic in the IDF. The Mapam Daily Al-Hamishmar. Again, my apologies for the pronunciation. The soldier told me how one of the soldiers opened a door and fired a sten, this is a type of gun, at an old man, an old woman, and a child in one burst. How they took the Arabs out of all of the houses and stood them in the sun all day, in thirst and hunger, until they surrendered 40 rifles. The Arabs had previously claimed that they hadn't had weapons, and in the end, they were expelled from the village towards Yibna. part of cover-ups. Remember, in recent discoveries, they found people who were zip-tied and buried alive near the Al-Shifa hospital, or if it's not Al-Shifa, one of the other hospitals in Gaza. And what we've seen different from this time in 1948 is the Israelis don't even care anymore about trying to hide their crimes. What we saw here was, according to Ben Yehuda, Kelman's company CEOs all refused to massacre the prisoners or to allow their men to do it. In the end, Kelman found two broken men who did not belong to the fighting formations and who claimed they had previously suffered at Arab hands to do the killing. Subsequently, he assigned Ben Yehuda to untie the hands of the dead as a Red Cross visit to the area was expected. So they knew the Red Cross was coming, and so they needed to cover up their atrocities. And so they needed to, but what we're seeing now in 2024 is they're not bothering with that anymore. They're murdering people and then burying them alive with zip-tied hands, because they know that the world won't really do anything about it. And even if the world orders something, then they'll just disobey it. Something that's fascinating is, both in interviews and in this book, Morris takes a lot of issue with the massacre that happened in Tantura, the alleged massacre that happened in Tantura. But once again, this is a question of what he reports seems to contradict his own personal position. A few days after the conquest of Tantura, Yaakov Epstein of Zikron Yaakov, the Ministry for Minority Affairs, man in the Moshava and its longstanding liaison with Tantura, prepared a report. He had arrived in the village minutes or hours after the completion of the conquest on the morning of the 23rd of May. He reported that he had seen bodies everywhere, in the village outskirts, in the streets, in the alleys, in the village houses, and had had a hand in organizing their burial, but he had made no mention of a recently completed or ongoing massacre of the sort, of any sort. So Morris says, this guy said he saw bodies everywhere, in the outskirts, in the streets, in the alleys, in the village houses, but there was no ongoing massacre or recently completed massacre. As if a massacre can only happen if all the bodies are in one place. You can have massacres happen in different ways. That's not a definition. Massacres only happen when everybody's gathered in one place. You can massacre a whole village by going around and killing everybody in their house. Because this guy, he says he had made no mention of a massacre or allegations of a massacre. So since he didn't mention that, that means once again, this is Morris's legalistic, I need to look at the words and that's the quote unquote evidence, therefore, blah, 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 blah. It's frustrating about Morris, but as I say, we owe him a great debt. Look at all the documentation he's provided us. Providing basic services and food for the remaining Arab inhabitants was to burden the second-line territorial units that replaced the 3rd and 42nd Battalions in the days after the conquest. So did the presence of hundreds of unburied corpses littering Lydda streets and houses and the road between Lydda and Ramla between the 12th and the 15th of July. Initially, at least, the corpses posed a political problem. As the new Kiryati military governor of Ramla put it, the scheduled visit by the Red Cross tomorrow is too early and must be delayed. When at last the visit was finalized for 3 o'clock, Dani HQ instructed Kiryati to by then evacuate all the refugees and to get rid of the corpses. But the problem was still unresolved on the 15th of July. Dr. Klaus Dreyer of the IDF Medical Corps complained to General Staff Operations that there were still unburied bodies in Lydda and neighboring fields and that they were a health hazard and a moral and aesthetic issue. The Medical Corps hadn't the wherewithal to deal with them. He asked General Staff Operations to find the trucks and personnel, including some tens of Arab civilians from the towns themselves, to solve the problem. Presumably, the corpses were then buried so that the Red Cross couldn't see them. If the Red Cross had seen them, they could be reported to the world press, and potentially the Israelis could be held accountable, but that didn't happen. One of the things what Gideon Levy talks about, and I'll link to my review of one of his works, is the dehumanization that this is not one-way trauma. While the Palestinians are receiving the majority of the trauma, the Israelis are also imposing trauma on themselves, whether they know it or not. And part of that is dehumanizing themselves, removing the ability to empathize with their fellow human being. So this is one example of that. This is Abba Kovner, a former anti-Nazi partisan. declared, "Suddenly, the ground was soft under the wheels of the jeeps. Bodies, tens of bodies under their wheels. The driver was put off, human beings under his wheels. But wait a minute." He remembered Kibbutz Negba and Beit Daras. In both, Arab troops had killed Jews, and he ran them over. "Do not be deterred, sons. Murderous dogs, their punishment is blood. And the more you run over bloody dogs, the more you will love the beautiful, the good, and liberty." Oh, this passes for poetry. I mean, this is supposed to be what sort of fruit does poetry like that produce? Don't answer that. Or you don't need to answer that. During the days after Shoter, the IDF blew up much of Ain Hazal and Jabba. Arab spokesmen complained of Israeli brutality and atrocities. Tawfiq Abul-Huda, the Jordanian prime minister, cabled the UN that the villagers were subjected to savage treatment of the cruelest kind known to humanity. Masses were forced to evacuate their homes. Another complaint spoke of 4,000 dead or missing in Ijzim. On the morning of the 29th of July, a team of UN observers at Bernadotte's behest visited the village and found not one body. But they were not looking hard. There were bodies in the villages, lying under rubble, in the outlying militia outposts, and in the surrounding hills, of those strafed and shelled by IDF aircraft and artillery or killed in ambushes. According to one IDF report, some 200 Arab bodies were found in the Little Triangle. IDF teams buried them. Why? Well, because they didn't want the Red Cross to find them. They certainly didn't care about the dignity of the Palestinians. They just didn't want the world to know. So that's why they took the time to bury them. One commander ordered a sapper to put 2 old women in a certain house and blow it up. The sapper refused. The commander then ordered his men to put in the old women, and the evil deed was done. One soldier boasted that he had raped a woman and then shot her. One woman with a newborn baby in her arms was employed to clean the courtyard where the soldiers ate. She worked a day or two. In the end, they shot her and her baby. The soldier, according to Kaplan, said that cultured officers had turned into base murderers, and this not in the heat of battle, but out of a system of expulsion and destruction. The less Arabs remained, the better. This principle is the political motor for the expulsions and the atrocities. So once again, Morris tells us there wasn't a giant order, there's no conspiracy, and yet we have testimony over and over and over that this was not a few bad apples or an abuse that happened here or there, but this was a systemic thing. And he says cultured officers had turned into base murderers, and this not in the heat of battle, but out of a system of expulsion and destruction. This principle is the political motor for the expulsions and the atrocities. The fewer Arabs remained, the better. This was the policy of the peaceful Jewish state that Herzl promised us would bring peace to humanity. If only he had lived to see it. Aharon Cohen entry for the 6th of November, 1948. Quoting Gali or Aram, speaks of 52 adult males tied together and dropped into a well, and of 3 cases of rape, including of a 14-year-old girl. Namani also mentions several cases of rape and a number of dead women. Namani heard the details from Emanuel Friedman, the old HIS AD hand, and MOM representative in Eastern Galilee. So this is a former Haganah intelligence officer that communicated these details, not some UN anti-Semitic conspiracy. It is possible that the facts described in Cohen's notes also originated with Friedman. It is possible that some of those dumped in the well had died during the bombing of and battle for Safsaf, and only a minority were murdered after the battle. Arab oral testimony from the early 1970s, as recorded by Nazal, more or less corroborates the contemporaneous Jewish documentation. Well, I have to say, I'm fairly shocked to see Benny Morris citing Arab oral testimony, because he's the one who says that it's not reliable and it shouldn't be trusted. And yet here he says it more or less corroborates the contemporaneous Jewish documentation. So would that not be a case for looking at Arab oral history in order to see whether it corroborates with it, and that would give it even more force? According to Nazal, the soldiers raped 4 women and blindfolded and executed about 70 men. The soldiers then took their bodies and threw them on the cement covering of the village spring. Soldiers who came afterwards assured the remaining villages that they would not be harmed further, but the villagers fled to Lebanon. What a surprise. I can't imagine that they didn't believe the IDF soldiers that they would be fine. So what about the looting that went on? So it wasn't enough to murder people. It wasn't enough to kill them. You have to steal from them as well. This is about Tiberias, which is near the Sea of Galilee. Not near the Sea of Galilee. It's on the Sea of Galilee in the north. Sorry about that. But within hours, the Jewish mob descended upon the evacuated areas and began to pillage the shops. The looting was halted by the armed intervention of the Jewish police. HIS reported that both Jewish residents and Haganah soldiers participated in the robbery on a large scale. There were disgusting incidents of robbery by commanders and disputes among people who fought over the loot. The looting continued intermittently during the following days, and several malefactors were arrested. A number were seriously injured by Haganah troops. In one incident, a Haganah man shot a Sephardi looter who later died. The largely Sephardi townspeople remarked that the Ashkenazis shoot only Sephardis. That's a conversation for another time. Looting was resumed on the 22nd of April, when the Haganah and the police completely lost control over their own people in the looting. This is how ridiculous the looting was. Groups of dozens of Jews walked about pillaging from the Arab houses and shops. The Haganah people hadn't the strength to control the mob after they themselves had given a bad example. It was as if there were a contest between the different Haganah platoons stationed in Migdal, Genosar, Yavniel, En Gev, who came in cars and boats and loaded all sorts of goods, such as refrigerators, beds, etc. Quite naturally, the Jewish masses in Tiberias wanted to do likewise. Old men and women, regardless of age, religious and non-religious, are all busy with robbery. Shame covers my face. As well it should, my friend. At least you have the dignity to admit that. As the Israeli force was about to leave, an Arab approached the commander, began to kiss his hands and feet, and complained that during the search, a batch of banknotes had disappeared from the pocket of a coat that had been hanging in his house. The commander announced to the assembled platoons that the force would not move out until the money was returned and that the culprit would not be punished. Suddenly, the money was dropped on the floor. The villager was given back his money, and he then kissed the commander's feet and hands again and again. We returned to base satisfied, but with a bitter taste. It's not enough to terrorize people. You have to steal from them too. And thankfully, kudos to this IDF officer who had the integrity to resolve the situation and give the money back to this man. There is no doubt that the Lydda Ramla affair and the flight of the inhabitants, the uprising and the expulsion that followed, cut deep grooves in all who underwent these experiences. These events were accompanied and followed by a great deal of looting. The 3rd Battalion was withdrawn from Lydda on the night of 13 to 14 July, and along with the brigade's other battalions, spent the following day in a soul-searching gathering in the Ben Shemen Wood, where they were berated by Cohen and forced to hand over their loot, which was subsequently thrown onto a large bonfire and destroyed. But the looting of the empty houses of Ramla and Lydda by groups of troops continued, apparently for weeks. So here we have an instance, as we saw previously with that officer who made his soldier give the money back. Here he takes them out into the forest, yells at them for a day, makes them burn all their loot, and then they continue to go on, which means that the majority of the IDF were thieves. Were thieves in addition to being thugs, murderers, rapists, etc. And this is the generation that is worshipped by the Israelis as the builder generation. This is the generation that fought the British, and they fought the Palestinians, and they fought the 6 armies that were going to drive us into the sea. This is the moral character of the people who built Israel. Look in the mirror and see if you can stand it. And that would matter to people of conscience. But since we know that the Israeli public venerate these people, we know that we can't appeal to them morally because they have no morals. And I'm speaking again, the vast majority of Israelis. I know that there are Israelis who work for peace. I had the privilege to meet some of them when I was in Palestine and Israel, I guess it was last year around this time. And I'm very grateful for them. There are many say many, there are quite a few Israelis that are working for peace and who understand what's going on, and I applaud them. But the majority, the vast majority, the polity of the state of Israel applauds this behavior and sees it as completely normal and natural. One of the troops described the operation in great detail. He wrote that they set out with a feeling of merriment. Later, they captured several fear-filled, shocked Arabs whose miserable appearance caused mixed feelings of contempt and pity. The soldiers sat around discussing whether or not to kill them. In the end, after deciding in half-jest that they should not be killed but turned into drawers of water and hewers of wood, as Joshua had done 3,000 years before with his Gibeonite prisoners, the troops fed them bread and cheese and gave them water. It emerged from IDF interrogation of the captives that the refugees encountered were from Yibna, Zarnuka, and Kabiba, were encamped around Majdal, and were trying to reap their fields. The hunger rampant among the refugees forces them to endanger themselves and penetrate our area. Open the full IDF report on the operation. Once again, I'm grateful to those IDF soldiers who didn't kill these people, gave them some bread and cheese, showed them a little bit of compassion and humanity, and didn't massacre them as so many of their compatriots did. I want to recognize these moments of humanity, and it's proof that Israelis they possess that ability to be humane in certain circumstances, but it was not the majority then, and it is not the majority now. A Palma account by a woman soldier, Aviva Rabinovitz, of Kibbutz Kabri, of a patrol in the Hebron Hills near Al-Jaba in the wake of the Harel offensive, illustrates the immediate fate and condition of the refugees from these hilltop villages. Scattered in the gully, sitting in craters and caves, were dozens of refugees. We surprised them. A cry of fear cut through the air. They began to praise us and dispense compliments about the Jewish army, the state of Israel. With what obsequiousness! Old men bowing, genuflecting, kissing our feet, and begging for mercy. Young men standing with bowed heads and helpless. We tried to persuade them to flee towards Hebron. We fired several shots in the air, and the people were indifferent. Better that we die here than return to the Egyptian-held territory to die at the hands of the Egyptians. We fired again. No one moved. Tiredness and hunger deprived them of any will to live and of any human dignity. These are the Arabs of the Hebron Hills, and it is possible that this youngster or that man shed the blood of the 35 or looted the Etzion block after its fall in May. But can one take revenge here? You can fight against people of your own worth, but against this human dust? We turned back and returned to our base. That evening, for the first time during the whole war, I felt I was tired. My soul has grown weary of this war. So, once again, I want to pay tribute to that documentation of pity, of a bit of humanity, realizing you can't just massacre civilians who are defeated like that. And yet, over and over, this was done. So this is one of the few times it wasn't done, and it was chronicled here, and I appreciate that. But that isn't what happened. Most of the time, defenseless civilians were murdered in their beds, were murdered in their houses. We've heard all of this already. So one of the things that we've seen post-Oslo is the movement of the Zionist state to create what it was called facts on the ground, which is, oh, look, there's already a settlement here, so this is going to be part of the new borders. And this was happening. This isn't something new that happened at Oslo. It's a long tradition that dates back here until 1948. In mid-May, Danin resigned from the Committee for Arab Property. Danin wrote Weitz that what was needed was an institution whose role will be to seek ways to carry out the transfer of the Arab population at this opportunity when it has left its normal place of residence. Danin thought that Christian organizations could be found acting under the rubric of helping the refugees, which would assist in their resettlement in the Arab countries. Let us not waste the fact that a large Arab population has moved from its home, and achieving such a thing would be very difficult in normal times. To prevent a refugee return, they must be confronted with fait accompli. Among the fait accompli Danin proposed were the destruction of Arab houses, settling Jews in all the area evacuated, and expropriating Arab property. And this is the conclusion that Benny Morris gives us. Is, well, we can't give the land back. Everything's been destroyed and there are Jews living there now. And of course, the Jews can be asked to leave. So it isn't something It isn't, when they say they're trying to create facts on the ground, those facts on the ground are not irrefutable. You can have people move. They were moved then in the first place. They're not entitled to it. They didn't pay for it. They didn't cultivate that land. And so there has to be some element of justice. And these people did not take up arms. A lot of these people were just civilians who were expelled from their villages. They didn't fight against the Israelis. They were unarmed, and a lot of times they were murdered, raped, killed. Who is this? Shaham. So anyway, this is someone else who's trying to deal with the settlement question. He ruled that there was a necessity and unrepeatable opportunity in the near future to determine facts on the ground, which any political solution in the future will not be able to ignore. That's the idea. Making these faits accomplis will have a major influence in facilitating our military actions and consolidating our conquests. And that we would see this also in the moments leading up to a ceasefire or a truce, is the IDF would also do offensives, last-minute offensives, to try to push their lines forward to create these so-called facts on the ground. And that's still happening to this very day and moment and hour. As I'm speaking right now, recording this video in 2024, Israeli settlements are being illegally established in the West Bank, trying to create facts on the ground. More ambitiously, on the 11th of March, the IDF mounted a series of major pushes eastward to create facts on the ground in advance of the UN survey of the Jordanian and Israeli positions scheduled for later that day. Before the UN arrive, let's have an attack so we can establish more facts on the ground. So as we get to the end of the book, Morris has a chapter here called Solving the Refugee Problem. And you have to realize that there are two things at play here. One is that the Arab countries which are housing the refugees now are trying to insist on a return of all the refugees, and the Israelis don't want any refugees. And so the international mediators are trying to say, well, let's pick a number, and at least Israel can take in some of that, and then we can figure out the rest later. And at some point, if you read this chapter, you can see that maybe there might have been within the cabinet the possibility of this, but public opinion had so swung the other way that this became impossible. And they didn't possess the leadership ability to persuade their people otherwise that this would be an important path to peace. This is something that we would see during the Dayton Accords in resolving the Yugoslav wars, that those leaders were able to go back to their people who were inflamed by murders, executions, ethnic cleansing, that said, hey, we're going to have to give up some things in order to have peace. But the Israelis have never been willing to do that. Over and over, there has been a lack of desire to seek peace. And it starts here in 1948. In fact, Ben-Gurion denied emphatically that Israel had expelled the Arabs. The state of Israel expelled nobody and will never do it. This is just a straight up lie. With all of the evidence in this book, he's quoting the father of the nation, one of the fathers of the nation, as saying that Israel never expelled anybody, when Ben-Gurion over and over and over gave unwritten expulsion orders. The upshot of the consultative meetings in Tel Aviv was a reiteration of the traditional line: no substantial repatriation, no gesture, and no statement on the number of returnees Israel might be willing to take back within the framework of a settlement. So the idea is, the three no's of the Arab League, no recognition, etc. Well, we have these three no's of the Israelis as well, in a lot of intransigence on their part. Israel was a state created upon an ethical concept and should rest upon an ethical base. Her attitude toward refugees is morally reprehensible and politically short-sighted. She has no security that does not rest in friendliness with her neighbors. I mean, it sounds very sober and important. One of the international delegates who was dealing with the Israelis. Firstly, the Jews believe that it is possible to achieve peace without paying any price, maximal or minimal. They want to achieve Arab surrender of all the areas occupied today by Israel, Arab agreement to absorb all the refugees in the neighboring Arab states, Arab agreement to rectification of the present frontiers in the center, south, and Jerusalem area in favor of Israel only, etc., etc., etc. The refugees, wrote Sasson, had become a scapegoat. No one pays attention to them. No one listens to their demands, explanations, and suggestions, but all use their problem for purposes which have almost no connection to the aspirations of the refugees themselves. This is something that goes on to the present day. Refugees are not allowed to speak for themselves. They don't exist. They're just used as pawns, both by the Arabs and by the Israelis. And that's a great tragedy. Israel has allowed public opinion to develop to such an extent that it is almost impossible for the Israeli government to make substantial concessions regarding refugees and territory. How did that public opinion develop? Because of the policies of the government during the war and the act and conduct of the civilians of the military who then went back and talked to their family, the civilians, and influenced the way that they thought about things. And finally, this concept of moving goalposts, I talked about this in part 1 of the review as well, which is at first it was we just wanted a Jewish home in Palestine, a place for the Jews, a little place for us to live, and then it became we're going to have a state, and then now we're going to have a state which has the majority of the land, even though we're a minority of the population, and then we get to take over the Arab parts as well, and we get to expel the Arabs. The goalposts keep moving. Now we're going to take over the Golan Heights, which are part of Syria. We're going to take over the Sinai, which is part of Egypt. This goes back to this messianic vision of Jabotinsky, etc., where they want both the west and the east bank of the Jordan. They want all of it. They want to go out to the Euphrates. However, politically and militarily, it was clear to most Israelis that a return of the refugees would be disastrous. Militarily, and the war, all understood, was far from over. It would mean the introduction of a large potential fifth column. Politically, it would mean the reintroduction of a large disruptive Arab minority. If you want to have a democracy, you're going to have to deal with a minority. If you want an ethnically pure Jewish state, well, say it. The military commanders argued against a return, so did political common sense. Both were reinforced by strident anti-return lobbying by settlements around the country. So, of course, I recommend this. It's a long read. As I said, 638 pages. One of the longest, if not the longest, read I've had in this project so far. And I think probably 2 of the longest reviews I've had to do. Thank you. If you're still here watching, thank you for staying and listening to these difficult facts, which Morris has taken the time to research, put together for us, and footnotes so we can go look it up ourselves. I appreciate that. And whatever I think or feel about Benny Morris's political and personal opinions, I'm grateful to the work that he did on this. If you'd like to support the channel, please hit like, subscribe, share this with people who you think are open-minded and willing to listen. One way you can support the channel is buying a copy of the book yourself. If you want to dig in and get through 638 pages yourself, I promise you it'll be worth it. It'll be difficult reading, but it'll be worth it. You can also support the channel by sending a super thanks via YouTube. You can become a member of YouTube. You can become a member of my Patreon. That will get you early releases of videos like this one and a chance to chat with me about what's going on behind the scenes and how I'm picking the books and what I'm thinking about as I'm putting together these reviews. A reminder that revenue from all these different streams, a portion of which will be going in 2024 to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. If you don't know about their work, please click on the link in the description to learn more. You can choose to donate to them directly, or if you'd like, support the channel and donate to them indirectly through me. There's also my Amazon wish list if you'd like to see the books that I'm considering for 2025. And you could say sponsor that video by buying that book and having it sent to me. As always, enjoy your reading.